June 1943, Robertson County, Texas. The train doors groaned open, and the first thing the German women smelled was mesquite smoke drifting across the prairie wind. Not the smell of defeat. Not the smell of death. Just barbecue, cattle, and hay baking under a sun so relentless it turned the horizon into liquid glass. They stepped onto American soil expecting chains, darkness, and the brutality their propaganda officers had promised. What they found instead would shatter every lie the Third Reich had ever told them. Before we continue, if you're captivated by the hidden human stories that changed World War II, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and share this with anyone who believes history's most powerful lessons come from its quietest moments. Your support keeps these forgotten voices alive. The women stood on that wooden platform in threadbare uniforms, faces gaunt from weeks of transit, eyes scanning for the torture chambers they'd been told awaited them. An American sergeant approached with canteens of cold water. His voice was gentle. His smile was genuine. And in that moment, watching him treat them like human beings instead of enemies, the first hairline crack appeared in the wall of lies they'd carried across the Atlantic. But the real shock was still coming. The shock that would arrive not with violence, but with a simple meal in a Texas mess hall where black soldiers and white soldiers sat together, ate together, and laughed as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The women who arrived at Camp Hearn weren't frontline soldiers, though many had served in combat zones. They were Nachrichtenfeld communications specialists for the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffenhelfen who'd operated searchlights and radar stations during Allied bombing raids, nurses who'd worked field hospitals in Tunisia and Sicily, clerks who'd processed intelligence in occupied France, radio operators who'd listened to encrypted traffic in bunkers beneath Berlin. Most were between 20 and 30 years old. All had volunteered for service in the Bund Deutscher Machtel before graduating to military roles. They'd been raised on Joseph Goebbels' propaganda reels. They'd watched films depicting American soldiers as savage brutes who raped German women and murdered prisoners without trial. One poster showed a caricatured American GI standing over a pile of German corpses with the caption, "This is the enemy. Expect no mercy." The women believed it because belief was survival. Doubt was treason, and treason meant death. When they were captured, some in North Africa, others in Sicily and Italy, several tried to take their own lives rather than face what they'd been told awaited them. The lucky ones were stopped. The unlucky ones succeeded before Allied medics could intervene. Those who survived the journey across the Atlantic spent the voyage in silence, mentally preparing for torture that would never come. They didn't speak. They didn't eat. They simply waited for the nightmare to begin. Camp Hearn was one of over 600 prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the United States during World War II. At its peak, America held more than 400,000 German POWs on domestic soil, more than the population of Minneapolis at the time. The camps were distributed strategically, often in rural areas where agricultural labor was desperately needed and escape was nearly impossible. Texas alone hosted more than 50 such facilities. Hearn was unusual. It wasn't just a camp for men. By mid-1943, the U.S. military had begun housing captured female auxiliaries separately, and Hearn's annex became one of the few coeducational POW facilities in the American interior. The women lived in a separate compound, but they shared mess facilities, medical services, and recreational areas with the male prisoners. This arrangement was born of logistics, not ideology. The military simply didn't have enough resources to build entirely separate camps. But it created something unprecedented, a space where German nationals, indoctrinated in racial purity and totalitarian propaganda, would confront an America they'd been taught didn't exist. The Camp Hearn compound covered roughly 40 acres of Robertson County prairie. Wooden barracks painted white stood in orderly rows. A mess hall large enough to seat 300. A recreation yard with a makeshift soccer field. even a small library stocked with donated books from churches in Houston and Dallas. The perimeter was fenced with barbed wire, yes, but the guard towers were staffed by bored teenagers from Waco who spent more time reading comic books than watching prisoners. It looked nothing like the concentration camps the women had heard whispered about in quiet corridors back in Germany. And it certainly looked nothing like what they'd been told American camps would resemble. The women were processed through intake on their first day. Photographs, medical exams, delousing stations. Standard wartime protocol. But the American medics were calm, professional, even kind. One nurse from Louisiana offered a German clerk a piece of Hershey's chocolate. The clerk stared at it like it was poison before finally, hesitantly, accepting it. The chocolate tasted like nothing she'd ever known. Sweet, rich, abundant. In Germany, chocolate had been rationed since 1940. Here, a nurse handed it out casually as if there were endless supplies, which, of course, there were. Then came the first meal. The mess hall was a long wooden structure with high ceilings and ceiling fans that barely cut through the Texas heat. Tables stretched in parallel rows, benches on either side. The German women entered together, nervous eyes darting for danger. And then they saw it. Black soldiers and white soldiers sitting together, eating together, talking and laughing as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For a long moment, the women simply stood frozen. They had been taught that America was a nation of mongrels, a decadent empire where racial mixing led to chaos and collapse. The Nazi ideology of Aryan supremacy depended on the idea that other nations, especially America, were genetically inferior precisely because of their diversity. Untermensch, they'd been told. Subhuman. A society so fractured by racial conflict that it would collapse under the weight of its own degeneracy. But here, in a Texas mess hall, in the middle of nowhere, Black G is from Alabama, and white farm boys from Iowa shared tables, passed salt shakers, and joked about baseball scores. One of the German nurses, a woman named Greta Hartmann, later wrote in her diary, "I could not understand what I was seeing. Everything we were taught said this was impossible. That such a thing would destroy a military." Yet they seemed stronger for it. The cognitive dissonance was paralyzing. It was as if gravity had reversed, as if the sun had risen in the west. The American military in 1943 was not, by any modern measure, racially integrated. Executive Order 8802, signed by President Roosevelt in 1941, had banned discriminatory hiring in defense industries, but the armed forces remained deeply segregated in practice. Black soldiers served in separate units, often under white officers. They were disproportionately assigned to labor and supply roles rather than combat positions. The Red Ball Express, the legendary supply convoy that kept Patton's Third Army moving across France, was 90% black, yet few Americans knew their names. But at Camp Hearn, pragmatism trumped protocol. The camp was understaffed. The mess hall couldn't accommodate staggered seating schedules. So black guards and white guards ate at the same time in the same room, under the same roof. It was a logistical necessity. But to the German women, it was a revelation. They had been told that racial integration weakened nations, that diversity was decay. Yet here was an army that had crossed an ocean, stormed fortresses, and defeated Wehrmacht's divisions in North Africa and Italy. An army built on a framework that Nazi ideology claimed was impossible. The women settled into camp life slowly. Days were structured around work details. Some cleaned barracks, others helped in the camp gardens, growing tomatoes, squash, and okra that supplemented the mess hall rations. A few with nursing backgrounds assisted in the infirmary, treating minor injuries and illnesses among both prisoners and guards. The guards were a mix of older men deemed unfit for frontline combat and younger soldiers recovering from injuries sustained overseas. Many were drafted farm boys who saw POW duty as boring but safe. They treated the prisoners not with cruelty but with casual indifference. A few even struck up tentative friendships. One guard, a corporal from Tennessee named Earl Hodges, spoke broken German, learned from his grandmother. He'd chat with some of the women during their garden shifts, asking about their hometowns, their families. At first, the women were suspicious. Was this some elaborate interrogation tactic? But Hodges wasn't gathering intelligence. He was just lonely, homesick, and curious. Greta Hartman wrote about Hodges in July 1943. He asked me if Berlin was beautiful. I told him it was, before the bombs. He said he hoped to visit someday after the war. I did not know what to say. The idea that this war would end and we would simply go home seemed like fantasy. But the integration continued to haunt the women. It appeared everywhere. In the recreation yard, where black and white soldiers played cards together. In the supply depot, where a black sergeant gave orders to white privates who obeyed without hesitation. In the infirmary, where a black medic treated a white officer's infected cut with the same care he gave everyone else. The women watched, and watching, they began to question. The German men held at Herne reacted differently. Many clung to Nazi ideology more fiercely, using the camp's relative freedom to organize clandestine resistance cells. They held secret tribunals, punishing prisoners they deemed disloyal. Some even murdered fellow posts suspected of collaboration. Camp Herne would later become infamous for one such killing, where hardline Nazis beat a fellow prisoner to death for expressing doubt about German victory. But the women, isolated in their compound, had less ability to enforce ideological purity. And slowly, the walls began to crack. August 1943. The heat was murderous. Temperatures climbed past 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The camp's water supply ran low, and prisoners and guards alike moved sluggishly through their routines. One afternoon, a black soldier named Private Nathaniel Cole was assigned to repair a section of fencing near the women's compound. He worked shirtless in the sun, hammering posts into the hard Texas clay. A group of German women sat in the shade of their barracks, watching him work. One of them, a former radio operator named Ilse Becker, stood and approached the fence. She spoke no English. Cole spoke no German. But she held out a tin cup of water she'd saved from her morning ration. Cole looked at her, surprised. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Cole took the cup, drank, and nodded his thanks. He said something she didn't understand. She smiled. It was a small thing, barely worth noting. But it was the first time Ilse Becker had seen a black person as simply a person. She wrote later, in a letter smuggled out decades after the war, "I had been taught he was subhuman. But when he thanked me, his eyes were kind." I felt ashamed. The women began to notice other things. The black soldiers were often the most disciplined, the most professional. They didn't complain. They didn't slack. They performed their duties with quiet dignity, despite being assigned the least desirable tasks. The white soldiers, by contrast, griped constantly, cut corners when they could, and treated guard duty like a joke. It was a subtle inversion of everything the women had been taught. The so-called master race was whining about the heat while the men they'd been told were inferior worked without protest. Greta Hartman wrote, "I began to wonder if we had been lied to about other things." By autumn, the women had settled into a strange routine. The war felt distant, almost abstract. News filtered in through camp newspapers and smuggled letters. The Allies had invaded Italy. The Red Army was pushing west. German cities were being reduced to rubble by Allied bombers. Hamburg had been firebombed in July, killing over 40,000 civilians in a single week. But in Herne, life continued in its odd, dislocated rhythm. The camp organized recreational activities. Volleyball games, talent shows. A small theater troupe performed German-language plays for the prisoners. American guards sometimes attended, understanding nothing but applauding politely. One evening, the camp held a joint concert. A German pianist, a former conservatory student captured in France, played Beethoven on an old upright piano in the recreation hall. Black soldiers and white soldiers sat in the audience beside German posts. For 40 minutes, the war disappeared. There was only music. When the concert ended, the American soldiers stood and applauded. The German prisoners stood too, hesitant, then clapping along. Greta Hartmann later wrote that she cried that night, though she couldn't explain why. It was in these small moments that the propaganda crumbled. The women had been told Americans were savages, barbarians, a nation of racial chaos, doomed to failure. But the soldiers guarding them were farmers, factory workers, and shopkeepers in uniform. They missed their families. They complained about the food. They were, against all expectations, deeply, boringly human. November 1943. The first cold front swept down from the north, bringing rain and dropping temperatures into the 40s. The camp became a sea of mud. Prisoners and guards alike slogged through the muck, cursing the weather. One morning, a white officer named Lieutenant Brennan slipped in the mud near the women's compound and twisted his ankle. He lay there swearing, unable to stand. A black medic named Corporal James Whitfield rushed over, helped him up, and half-carried him to the infirmary. Several German women witnessed the scene. One of them, Ilse Becker, stood transfixed. She had been taught that white Americans despised their black countrymen, that the U.S. military was perpetually on the brink of racial civil war. But here was a black soldier helping a white officer without hesitation, and the officer accepted that help without protest. Ilse wrote, "I watched him carry the lieutenant, and I thought, we were told this nation would collapse because of people like him. But it is us who have collapsed." By December, Germany's situation was undeniable, even to the most devoted prisoners. The camp newspapers reported the Tehran Conference, where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met to plan the final defeat of the Axis. Letters from home, heavily censored, hinted at devastation. Some prisoners stopped receiving letters entirely. Their cities had been bombed into ash. The women began to ask questions. Quietly at first, whispered conversations during work shifts. Why had they been taught to hate? Why had they been told lies? And what did it mean that the enemy they'd been sent to fight was feeding them, clothing them, treating their illnesses? Greta Hartmann wrote in early 1944, "The Americans defeated us not with cruelty, but with kindness. And that is the hardest defeat to bear." The war dragged on. Seasons changed. Camp Hearn expanded, eventually holding over 5,000 POs, both men and women. The annex where the women lived became almost a small village, with routines, hierarchies, and unspoken rules. Some women tried to maintain Nazi beliefs, holding secret meetings, reciting slogans, shunning those who fraternized with guards. But sustaining hatred grew harder with every passing day. Margaret Schiller, a former Luftwaffe clerk, began teaching English classes. American guards occasionally attended, amused by thick accents and earnest attempts. One guard brought a chalkboard. It was a small gesture, yet monumental. Margaret later recalled, "That chalkboard was the moment I knew Germany had lost not just the war, but the argument. They were helping us learn their language not to humiliate us, but because they thought we might need it someday." The black soldiers remained an enigma, polite, professional, utterly unlike the Nazi caricatures. Some women tried to rationalize them as exceptions, but the evidence kept piling up. A black guard sharing a cigarette. Black and white soldiers laughing over a clumsy mistake. An integrated crew repairing a roof. Ilse Becker wrote in March 1944, "If these are the mongrels we were told would destroy themselves, then I fear what that makes us." By April 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. Reports of liberated concentration camps reached Hearn. Guards spoke of gas chambers, mass graves, walking skeletons. Some prisoners refused to believe. Others wept. Greta Hartmann wrote, "We said it was propaganda. We said it could not be true. But then the photographs arrived, and we knew." Some women fell silent. Others denied everything. Greta began documenting their awakening and shame. Germany surrendered, but many prisoners stayed until 1947. Camp life grew strange, and liminal guards relaxed. Prisoners worked nearby farms, and the sight of black and white soldiers eating and working together became normal. By 1946, most were repatriated. Greta left last, realizing the worth of a man wasn't his skin. She returned to a ruined Germany, but kept her diary's records of a war witnessed in a Texas mess hall. Decades later, historians found them. Stories of women who discovered that the hatred they'd been taught was built on lies.